Today's lesson's on plants and photosynthesis, which is something which shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you because you should have started this in year 7. So if there is anything that you do struggle with, please feel free to use any other websites, for example BBC Bitesize or YouTube, to help you out. But what I need you to do is turn off your phone, make sure it's out of sight, out of mind. It's preferably in a different room. I'd like you to make sure you've got no other tabs or distractions open on your computer. Obviously, you need to answer all the questions, but to do that, you need the student booklet, which you can find on the John Smeaton website as instructed. And you can always pause and listen again to the video if you are stuck. Take as long as you need with it. What you need to be able to do by the end of this session is describe the function of the root and root hair cells, to be able to compare root hair cells to typical plant cells, and also to be able to explain how the adaptations of the roots are related to their function. The first task is your do now task. You need your booklet in front of you, either online or a piece of paper is fine as well. What I would recommend with this is to have the booklet open online in front of you, and then to write your answers down on a piece of lined paper, because it's much simpler to be able to do that, and you can also be able to mark it in a different colour much easier. So you should have a diagram which looks the same as the one on the slide, which is a diagram of what we would call a typical plant cell. So your first task is to label the plant cell with each part which are listed for you. For example, a cell wall. So what you need to do is you need to identify where the cell wall is and to add the label to the diagram. Like I said, if you don't want to do this online because you can't access the file, for example, and it won't let you edit it, please just feel free to do this on a piece of paper. Just make a rough sketch and then label each part as you go along. So I've labelled my cell wall, and what the second part of the task is asking you to do, it's asking you to state the function of that part of the cell. So if I don't know what the cell wall's for, what I need to do is I need to go on the internet, for example, onto BBC Bitesize, and I need to find out. So what you can do is just Google function of the cell wall, for example, and put it into the simplest words possible. Don't just copy out every word that comes up. Put it into a way which you understand it and which you would be expected to understand in class. So for example, the cell wall is for structure in plants. So pause for as long as you need to be able to complete the full diagram, and then the answers are going to be on the next slide, which you'll need a different coloured pen for. You should now be working in a different coloured pen, and you should see all the correct answers are now on the slide for you. So what I would like you to do is to improve the answers which you have come up with, because my instructions on the last slide were to put it into as few words as possible in order to describe the function of each part of the cell. So, for example, if for the nucleus, you said something like it is the brain of the cell, which is very descriptive and it's not necessarily what you need to look for there. So you need to improve it by adding in a different coloured pen that the nucleus contains the DNA. If, for example, for the ribosomes, you put protein synthesis, that is correct, but actually, did you know what protein synthesis meant? If you didn't, then I've put it into the simplest terms possible, and I've said that is where proteins are made. So you can add that extra note so it helps your understanding further. So pause the video for as long as you need to be able to improve your answers, and that is how you correctly label a typical plant cell. Moving on to new content, what do plants actually need their roots for? So there's several different jobs of the roots actually, and the jobs are that they stop weather or animals from uprooting them. They act like an anchor and they effectively keep the plant in the ground. The main job is also to absorb water and minerals as well, to keep the plant alive and to allow photosynthesis to happen. So we've looked at what the job of the roots is, and what we need to do now is we need to look closer at actually what do roots look like and how does that relate to their job, which we outlined on the previous slide. So if we look closely at a root, actually they have thin little hair-like structures along all of them. So what I would like you to do, I'd like you to think why do root hair cells have thin hairs on them? And I'd like you to tell me why do you think that relates to their job, particularly in terms of absorbing water and mineral ions. So pause the video for as long as you need to. So actually the reason that roots have these tiny thin little hairs is the roots are, like we said, it's where most minerals and water are absorbed into the plant. So the roots, you can see that they're long and thin, and that's so they can easily get in between tiny particles of soil. And also the hairs on them allows it to have a really large surface area. And the reason that is for maximum absorption. So basically, so they can absorb lots and lots of water at one time, as well as minerals, which plants need to stay alive as well. We've stated that plants need to absorb water and minerals through their roots, but actually how do they do that? So plants need water to carry out a process called photosynthesis, which shouldn't really be a new word to you, but if you're not sure about what photosynthesis is or what it's for, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to look up what is photosynthesis, what is it for, and what is the word equation for what goes into photosynthesis and then what comes out of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process which plants use to make energy for themselves. They make energy in the form of glucose, which is a sugar. Humans and animals, like ourselves, obviously, we don't photosynthesize because we can get that sugar from food. So the word equation for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide and water go in, and then glucose and oxygen come out. So obviously water is vitally important and it needs to get into the plant so photosynthesis can happen. Because without photosynthesis, there is no energy for the plant wouldn't be able to grow and it'd die. So roots have to be really adapted to do this job because this job is so vitally important. Exactly are roots adapted to their function? Roots are really branchy and they are really widely spread apart. The reason that is, and like we've talked about before, it's for absorbing the water and the minerals from the soil into the plant. We've also talked about the fact it's to be an anchor to keep the plant in the soil so it's not uprooted by animals or the weather. So other adaptations that the root has is it is covered in something called a root hair cell. So you can see a picture of a root hair cell to the right. It's a different shape than a typical plant cell, which we talked about in the Do Now task. As well as that, root hair cells have really thin walls, and that different shape gives them a large surface area, and that allows them to absorb lots of water at one time. And if we remember from the last slide that water is being used for photosynthesis, which is where the plant is making energy for itself. So roots are really adapted to absorb as much water as possible because they have root hair cells, which have thin walls and a large surface area. So your next task in your booklet is you've got a diagram of a root hair cell which looks the same as which is on the slide here. What I'd like you to do, using the information that you've heard so far, so you might want to go back and re-listen to the information if you get stuck. I'd like you to tell me how is the root hair cell like the typical plant cell that you labelled at the start. So what parts does it have in common to the cell which you labelled in the do now task? If I was to give you an example now, I'd say that both of them have a nucleus, because I can see the nucleus is highlighted on the diagram above, and we recognise that the nucleus was on the diagram in the do now task as well. We said it that contains the DNA for the cell. Second thing I want you to do is tell me how are they different. So what about the root hair cell is different to the typical plant cell which you saw in the do now task? You can talk about the parts of it, you can talk about the shape, you can talk about how the parts themselves differ. So pause the video for as long as you need, and you are completing the diagram in your booklet. Okay, so you should now be working in a different coloured pen, and you should be improving your comparison of the root hair cell and the typical plant cell. So your similarities are they both have a cell membrane, they both have a cell wall, they both have a nucleus, and they both have a cytoplasm. However, the differences between a root hair cell and your typical plant cell are you don't find chloroplasts in a root hair cell. So if you think about why that is, we're going to talk about on the next slide, but I'd like you to think about why would a root hair cell, bear in mind it is underground, why would it not have chloroplasts? The root hair cell is longer, it's got a longer cell membrane, and it's also got more mitochondria, so you also need to be thinking about why that may be. So make sure in a different coloured pen you've improved your answers in terms of the similarities and the differences between your typical plant cell and your root hair cell. So we've now identified the differences between a root hair cell and a typical plant cell. So what we need to do now is we need to be able to explain why do we have those differences. So we've stated that the job of the root hair cell is to absorb both water and minerals from the soil into the plant. So a long cell membrane gives it a larger surface area, and basically what that means is the root hair cell can absorb more water and more minerals at one time because it has got a bigger amount of space to do that. And it's that shape with the elongated cell membrane that allows it to do that. A typical plant cell is usually a square shape. It doesn't have the extended cell membrane, and it doesn't have as large of a surface area because basically it doesn't need one like the root hair cells do. Root hair cells also have more mitochondria, and if you look back at your do now task where you improved your answers, you should know that the mitochondria is for respiration. Respiration is for the production of a usable form of energy. So that helps to absorb mineral ions in a process called active transport. What I would like you to do is pause the video, and I would like you to use either BBC Bitesize, Google, or Free Science Lessons to tell me what is the definition of active transport. Pause the video, take as long as you need to, write down your definition on a piece of paper or your booklet. So active transport is the movement of molecules into or out of a cell from a region of low concentrations, basically where there's not very many of that substance, to a region of higher concentration where you've got lots of that substance. The particles, therefore, because they're going from a low to a high concentration, we say they're moving against the concentration gradient. And for that, they use energy, and we get that energy from respiration. And like we found out in the do now task, that respiration takes place in the mitochondria. So the fact that lots of active transport is taking place in the root explains why there is lots of mitochondria. So mitochondria is used for respiration is used for energy, and that energy is needed for active transport, which is moving mineral ions in this example against the concentration gradient, going from a low to a high concentration. Talked about mineral ions. Now what we need to talk about is how does the water get into the plant from the roots. And plants absorb water by a process called osmosis. Same thing as on the last slide. What I would like you to do is use either BBC Bitesize, free science lessons, or Google to find out what is the definition of osmosis. So pause the video for as long as you need to. So osmosis is basically it's the diffusion of only water. So that means it's going from an area where there is a high concentration of water to where there is a low concentration of water. Root hair cells are adapted for this because they have really thin cell membranes, and that basically means the water doesn't need to move as fast. So it's really easy for the water to get from the soil into the root. And again, that long cell membrane, the shape of the root hair cell comes in handy again because it gives a large surface area for the diffusion of water, which we know as osmosis. So the shape of the cell membrane being longer and the fact that it's thin makes it really easy for the water to move from the soil to the cell. Final task for this lesson is putting together everything that you've heard so far in the video. So the question is to compare a root hair cell to a typical plant cell. So what you need to be able to do to be able to be really successful on a compare question is you need to be able to say what is similar and what is different between the two cells. So we're talking about the typical plant cell, which we looked at in the Do Now task. And we're also looking at the root hair cell, which we've been looking at what is its job and what are its adaptations throughout the full lesson. So remember that you can always go back in the video, you can re-watch any of the slides, you can note down any of the information which you need, and you can also use the tasks which you have done so far. So, a model of how you should lay your answer out is on the slide. So what I've said is both the typical plant cell and the root hair cell have a cell wall for structure and support. So I've stated a clear similarity and I've said what that part is for. You will be expected to do the same thing for each part which the typical plant cell and the root hair cell have in common. So look back through your booklet or through the PowerPoint to identify which parts do both cell types have. When it comes to your differences, you need to do the same thing. You need to state what the difference is. For example, a typical plant cell has chloroplasts, but the root hair cell does not. This is because you'd use your answer from earlier on. So for a successful compare question, you need to have similarities and differences. Within those similarities and differences, you need to state what it is. For example, they both have a cell wall, so that's me stating what the similarity is. And then you need to say why. They both have a cell wall, what? for structure and support, which is your why. So pause for as long as you need to. You should be either typing this up in your booklet or doing it on a piece of lined paper, and then we will mark it together on the next slide. So please give it your best shot. So you should be working in a different coloured pen. Like I said, you should have started off, it's always easier to start off with your similarities, because basically what you're doing there is just to spot the difference between two diagrams. So both have a nucleus, that's my what, and then to control the cell is my why. So I've done the same thing with the cytoplasm, so they both have a cytoplasm, which is where the chemical reactions happen. They both have a cell membrane to allow diffusion, and a cell wall for structure and support. So if there is anything that you missed out there, please add it in a different colour to help you to improve your answer. So that's my similarities done, and you've got a perfect example of what a good one looks like for a compare question and how you would write down your similarities in terms of what are the similarities, why do they have them. So moving on to the differences, which are a little bit more complicated. So I've said, however, the root hair cell has a more elongated cell membrane. If you put a longer cell membrane, if you put a stretched out cell membrane, that's fine too. But I've just used the highest level language there. So you may want to improve your language by highlighting it and writing elongated next to it and put a definition for elongated there. So that's my what. I've said what does this root hair cell have, which the typical plant cell doesn't. Now I need to move on to my why, and I've said this is to give it a bigger surface area to absorb as much water and as many mineral ions as possible at one time. So remember, you state what is the difference, why do they have it. Remember to improve that in green or any colour pen if you made any mistakes at all. So, root hair cells also don't have chloroplasts. It's because the root hair cells, it's in the name, they're in the roots, they don't get any sunlight at all, so it's absolutely pointless that they have any chloroplasts, because the chloroplasts are for photosynthesis, and photosynthesis needs light to be able to happen, and they're not getting any light down there. Last one, that the root hair cell also has more mitochondria, and that's so they can release lots of energy for active transport. Remembering that active transport is for moving minerals from an area of low concentration, which is in the soil, to an area of high concentration, which is in the plant cell itself, okay? So remember, improve any in a different colour to help you out with what a good one looks like. It's completely optional. If you feel like you've really understood the content in here and you want to stretch yourself a bit further, have a go at the exam questions which are in the booklet. And what I would do is I would write your answers down on a piece of paper, and then you can send them to your teacher to be marked only if you wish. This is a completely optional task. Please also remember you need to complete the Educate quiz on today's content by the deadline, which is on a Monday at 8 AM.